looks like we have an alert here. So I changed the title. And I changed the title because I wanted to speak about not just innovation, but innovation's gone wrong, and that includes motivation's gone wrong. Not a talk you're going to likely hear anywhere else, but it's one I had some interesting experience putting together. I want to acknowledge the members of the Codman Shoulder Society that participated in my approach here, and Professor Christian Gerber, my long-term friend, colleague, teacher, and mentor. It's very important if I show you this talk that I disclose all of my conflicts of interest, because I'm sort of a habitual entrepreneur, and I've had a lot of companies that I've developed that have sold and many that are ongoing. So everything I do, I try to make sure it has a value proposition. And I showed this before, but in my Harvard Business School area, they had this article about innovation, and it's very difficult not just to innovate, but to innovate with a conscience. Now, I already told you about Codman. I showed that before. He was really one of the first innovators in Grammont and Near, and I wanted to make sure we revisited this because these were people that followed the appropriate approach for innovating. Now, this guy, Tom Crummell, is the co-director of the Center for Surgical Innovation. I reported on him before that he explained that surgeons innovate every day in the operating room, and this will be relevant in a few moments. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't start with one of the greatest innovators of our time, at least that I've known, and this was a consequence of the judges, of which I was one, representing the European, the American, the Asian societies, to pick the one individual who, over his lifetime, had the greatest innovation that changed care. And it's not a shoulder surgeon, although there were some that were nominated. This is Reinhold Ganz, who developed hip preservation surgery. And the changes that he made to people's lives that were enduring was quite remarkable and very courageous. But I want to point out what he said. In retrospect, he stated, innovation is barely possible without breaking the rules. Okay. Curiosity and lateral thinking are more helpful than follow-up studies and meta-analyses, and teamwork is indispensable to get going a project and bring it to maturity. And he says, I was privileged to work with extremely motivated individuals. Innovating is a team approach, not a single person approach. Now, we take many innovations for granted, and you look at this list here, these were all in their time innovations, but now we accept them for what they are. Now, I asked the Codman Shoulder Society members to come up with a list for me of the greatest innovations of the last 50 years, and you see them here. And he was the man that said, give me something that is different, for there's a chance of it being better. This was published in Rockwood and Matson's last book as an op-ed. Now, what I did with these is I looked at them and I thought, well, what's going down? And most of us would agree that transosseous rotator cuff repair is not so much innovation anymore. And what is derivative or standard? It was an innovation, but now it's routine. And as a consequence, it's replaceable by many other options. And then what's growing? And of course, we would agree that reverse prosthesis, etc., these are growing. Now, it's important to reconcile this with value. If you look at health being on the vertical axis, and if you look at cost being on the horizontal axis, you see where we are now. This is America. We are spending more and more for less and less. This is why there's so much going on in business to solve the healthcare cost crisis, whether it's through strategy or finance, or innovation and how you can disrupt with innovation, or why it's so hard. This is a wonderful book by one of my professors on why it's so hard. And then really this framework for innovation, and shows you that any innovation that's going to be successful must be profitable, reduce costs, and have advocates. If you have people against you, you go nowhere. And there are 6 factors, just briefly. Structure, which is who's your friend, who's your foe. Public policy, local and regional and national. Who's paying for it. Technology, patients, insurers, government. These are all relevant customers. And then how you measure your outcomes. I want to emphasize innovation isn't always evidence-based. We know that we don't need a prospective randomized study to prove that exiting a plane without a parachute is a bad idea. Yet we know that it's a good idea. And all innovation begins this way, and some go awry and stay down here. This is Death Valley. And basically when you innovate, you race against running out of money, you race against the chaos associated with changing the norm, and then when you get up to the new status quo, it's after a lot of pain and suffering. Usually that is the way innovations go. These are all innovators who changed treatment paradigms, and the one thing they virtually all of them share is, in one way or another, they were not academics. Reinhold Ganz did what he did after his peak as an academician. Sir John Charnley was an academician in the days when it really wasn't what it is now, and all these other people changed the world in which we live. For example, Ray Thal, most of you probably don't know him, he had the patent for the first knotless anchor for instability repair. And Rich Kaspari had 42 patents when he passed, but all these guys came from outside of the academic world. Now, I want to just pause for a minute and talk about when things go wrong. Now, this was a book written by one of my professors at Harvard Business School who is an accountant, and he's very interested in white-collar crime. And it was entitled, Why They Do It. Why do people do things that they know are wrong? And there are some examples, and I'll share some in shoulder surgery with you, but many of you may know the story of Theranos that was written as a book, Bad Blood, where there was a complete fraud of this machine that they created. And then The Bleeding Edge is a Netflix show that talks about how industry may rush innovations into practice before they're adequately proven. So there's greed, judgment, and conflict of interest. Now, it's fascinating when you realize if you look at evidence-based care as it's delivered right now, these are the percentages for the different specialties. 55% overall receive evidence-based care, the rest not. And you find no documentation of orthopedics or shoulder surgery here. I will tell you why in a minute. If you look at this book on evidence-based medicine by Mo Bandari, it is the Bible of evidence. And he's pointed out that the hierarchy of evidence is directly correlated to bias. Where have we been most of this meeting? We've been level 5, level 4, maybe level 3, not so much level 1 or 2. And there's more opportunity for bias as we are lower on this scale than at the top. We function based on level 3 and 4, maybe 5, in most of what we do. Ionides, who is a Greek countryman here, is at Stanford, very, very famous statistician, scientist. He wrote, most published research findings are wrong, and I encourage you to read that article because it's quite sobering. And when I wrote to Mo Bandari about randomized controlled trials in shoulder to demonstrate the evidence, this busy slide here, the overall risk of bias in shoulder randomized control studies in their analysis was 90%. Okay, so we use poor evidence to justify many things we know are not true. This is a slide from Christian Gerber, but if those of you who know him know he's usually on the dark, he's a little more negative than positive, but in this case, I think he's right. Now, I talked about it before. Statistical fragility of a study is this. The minimum number of patients for one arm of a trial that would alter the outcome of the trial from statistically significant to insignificant. Most statistically significant randomized control studies in sports medicine are not robust by the above criteria, and a change in outcome of only a few patients would alter the conclusions of the study. This is why you see so many studies that contradict each other. And frankly, when this was applied to shoulder arthroplasty, 74% of the studies had a fragility index less than the number of patients lost to follow-up. And 90% of all outcomes were statistically insignificant by this criteria. Now, there's also conflict of ego, which is the flip side of publish or perish. One of my professors, Thomas DeLong, used to say, how many shades does a white lie have? And we're very optimistic about things. This was a study here at the BMG Opinion Journal that stated time to assume that health research is fraudulent until proven otherwise, because it's based on trust and peer review. In their analysis, 526 trials submitted to anesthesia to the journal had 14% had false data. In 153 directly examined studies, 44% had untrustworthy data. Peer review is ineffective in detecting fraud, was their conclusion. And perverse incentives lead to fraudulent reporting, be they financial, professional, or otherwise. Human nature is human nature, whether it's accounting fraud or whether it's medical reporting. I don't mean to be so negative at the end of the meeting, but you should take everything with a grain of salt. Scientific misconduct is described by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services as research misconduct, meaning fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism in proposing, reporting, performing, or reviewing research and reporting the results. And in JAMA, the publication estimates were 1 to 2% of all research was truly fraudulent. 15 articles over 5 years were retracted because of fabricated or falsified data. And allegations of scientific misconduct are 10 to 12 times per year for that journal. Now, here is an article from our world. This was an article from many years ago publishing that rotational osteotomy of the proximal humerus would eliminate instability. The problem was, for a whole host of reasons, this was absolutely a fraud. And this was withdrawn, and there were problems for these people. But that's one of a number, but we don't pay attention to these so much. So what did the experts think were wrong, where innovation's gone wrong? I asked the Codman Shoulder Society group, and I love this definition. An expert is one who knows more and more about less and less until he knows absolutely nothing about everything. Anyway, I took faith on this. So this is a list many of you may find interesting. At the top of the list was thermal capsular shrinkage. You may remember this. Intra-articular pain catheters came next, and all these other so-called innovations, including, as you see on the right, Hylamer glenoids with catastrophic failure because of the material properties that failed. Now, I just put up some other joints as just to show you, metal on metal, hip replacements, and Gore-Tex ACL grafts. But our list goes on and on to a second page, including the history of metal back total shoulder arthroplasties and second-generation anatomical prostheses, which changed the anatomical configuration in a way that obligated geometry that failed. That we know to be the case. Now, the Scott's parabola shows the diffusion of technology. We go up the curve as we're enthusiastic, as we did with thermal shrinkage, as we did with metal-on-metal hips, Vioxx, and intra-articular pain pumps. And as soon as data is coming out that's more robust, we go down. Now, along the way, there's a profit generated for the company. And I'm sorry, there are mixed priorities here in terms of the need to generate profit and satisfy shareholders and the need to be cautious. Nothing would ever get done if we didn't take risk, but that risk should be evidence-based. Thermal capsulorrhaphy, this is from Christian Gerber, 31% failure at 39 months and difficult revisions in 42% with capsular thinning and necrosis. And if you look here, I don't know if many of you remember, you would run a wand over the capsule and it would shrink and it would seem to be nice and tight. And there was one very famous sports doctor who said that his pitchers in baseball got better if they had this in addition to slap repairs. He was also a shareholder. So the initially denatured collagen becomes brittle. Fibroblasts lay down new collagen, but it's brittle at the time. If we start early motion, the capsule will rupture. Furthermore, it creates a heat sink that can lead to chondrolysis. And we had nerve problems, and we also had arthritis. What followed? Smith & Nephew in 2002 bought this company for $310 million, after which, following immediately, all the insurance companies said, we're not paying for this. And then what actually happened was the president of Smith & Nephew resigned. I was there at this time. I knew him very well. Legal actions against the owners of the company, the ones that were the officers, because of suppressed complications. Multiple articles on complications, and then the law offices got involved. I think this is an example of the wrong side of innovation. Glenohumeral chondrolysis with pain pumps, we may all know too well. And this came from insertion of a catheter into the shoulder with epinephrine in bupivacaine, and that lowered the pH and that destroyed the cartilage of the glenohumeral joint. And if you look at follow-up, all you find are legal briefs. You can find nothing of actual outcomes of this treatment. So we could also debate single-row and double-row rotator cuff repairs because of cost issues and value-based care, and I don't want to get into that mess right now, but we don't have good evidence about either for a whole host of reasons that I've alluded to already. And certainly PRP, and somebody mentioned PRP here, and that's driven by the celebrities like Tiger Woods or Heinz Ward, who was a football player. And you can look at the cost of PRP in the coming years, and actually this is all the evidence on PRP for the shoulder, and there's no evidence. Yet it's popularized and given to patients all the time. Codman knew more than 100 years ago that if you improve someone's problem, it's lower cost than if they fail a treatment. So we are destroying the value equation in some of these cases. We analyzed outcomes as a correlation to volume, and we know that low experienced surgeons have more complications and increased costs. This is why I say it's so important to have a proposition for innovation where you make less experienced surgeons successful, because it costs everybody when they're not successful. And the problem with this is we look in the mirror and think we're better than we are, and unfortunately, it's not really the case. At my own institution, if you look at who performs shoulder arthroplasty, each color is a different surgeon in a different specialty area. Why in the world would anybody want to have a shoulder arthroplasty from the ones on the far right? Really, but patients don't know this. It's up to us to try to improve that. And learning curves, you want someone on the right side of the learning curve or the left side of the learning curve? Is this an innovation? No, it's an education. So 3 observations I will leave you with. Innovation requires risk, analysis, creativity, and courage. Gans did this. Innovation is a word that means different things to different people. Business school professors, one thing, insurance companies, another, executives, another, presidents of the hospital, another, surgeons, another. Human nature is constant. Conflict of interest is real, as is conflict of ego. We are all wired this way, and it's something we should be aware of. So if we come back to healthcare, if you look, this is where we want to be on the graph. We're over here. If we really innovate, we need to come back this way with what we innovate to remain on that part of the graph, because our economies will not sustain the innovations that we're doing so far. So a few words of some of my colleagues. Christian Gerber said, if you want to make a real contribution, your innovation must solve a real patient problem. This is also the reason why many startup companies fail. They don't identify a real problem with a large enough available market. Einstein said, most people say that it's intellect which makes a great scientist. They're wrong, it's character. And Jim Herndon, who was the president of the American Academy of Orthopedic Surgeons, the Board of Orthopedics, and the AOA, who is also my chairman, said it's no longer enough to do no harm, no longer good enough to do no harm. We must also do good. Thank you.